The smell of smoke and sirens piercing the dawn still echoes in my memory. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't an accident. It was my husband, glued to me, exposed, begging for help in front of everyone. Until that moment, no one imagined the weight of the secret he carried, much less how much I already knew. My life seemed normal, a stable marriage, a normal routine. But behind the silent walls of our home, an invisible crack grew, made of whispered lies, repeated apologies, and averted glances. I felt this crack widening with each night he returned too late, smelling of perfumes that weren't mine. With each message deleted before I could even ask. They say betrayal is like poison in drops. Almost imperceptible at first, but lethal over time. That's how I felt. As if the life we'd built together were a crystal glass being slowly scratched, until it suddenly shattered. And the fall came faster than I expected. He believed he was safe, that his lies were small enough to go unnoticed. But I saw, I heard, I noted every detail. Every silence at dinner, every embarrassed expression, every poorly rehearsed excuse. What he didn't know was that while I was pretending to be clever, I had already crossed a line within myself, the line between naivete and clarity. What's at stake when trust dies? It's not just love, it's dignity itself. I was no longer standing before a man, but before a cracked mirror. And each piece reflected a version of me he was trying to erase. The loyal woman, the complicit wife, the lifelong partner. He wanted to reduce me to nothing. And I wonder, how low can someone be before they rise up? That night something changed. The atmosphere in the house felt charged, as if the walls were breathing along with me. The silence had a metallic, heavy taste, and my heart beat like a distant drum announcing an imminent revelation. The truth doesn't hide forever. It's like glue. It sticks, hardens, holds. Sooner or later, no one can break free from it. And I knew the moment was coming. The moment when the whole world would see, with their own eyes, who he really was. I can still feel the rough texture of the sheets that night. I realized, without a doubt, that something had changed forever. He was beside me, but he seemed miles away. His body was present, but his mind was absent. His eyes, when they met mine, didn't linger. They vanished as if there was something urgent to be hidden. I pretended to sleep, but I heard every muffled ring of the cell phone under the pillow, every held breath as if I were complicit in a secret that wasn't mine. It was like living inside a house lit by dim lights. Everything seemed visible, but the shadows hid the most important details. The heart learns to speak in silence. His every gesture was a whisper of a lie. The untouched dinner plate. The rush to leave in the morning. The excuse of endless meetings. And I, who always offered understanding, began to feel the weight of being treated like background furniture. Have you ever felt this? Being in your own life and realizing someone is trying to push you out of the picture, as if your presence were too bothersome to remember. Sometimes I looked in the mirror and tried to find the woman he once claimed to love. I searched the lines on my face, the hair that time had dyed silver, the eyes that still held a sparkle despite the weariness. But the reflection returned a silent question. How much longer will you accept being invisible? It was in this silence that I began to understand that betrayal isn't just the physical act, but the daily abandonment, the kind that happens before everyone's eyes and yet seems imperceptible. I describe this in detail because I know I'm not alone. Many people carry this same emptiness within their homes, as if sharing a bed with a stranger. That's why so many remain here, following each revelation, because they recognize in this kind of pain something that has also touched their lives. This closeness, this identification, is proof that loneliness within a marriage is crueler than any physical absence. The following days were a mosaic of small fractures. He arrived late, carrying a scent that wasn't mine, and he packed his clothes with excessive care, like someone fearing discovery. I observed everything silently, every detail like a shard of glass shining in the dark. With each gesture, I collected invisible evidence, not with the haste of someone seeking immediate revenge, but with the patience of someone who knows that time reveals what pride tries to hide. It was like standing before an old painting, where layers of paint obscure the true image. Little by little, the cracks in the disguise began to appear, and what he believed to be a secret became an increasingly clear picture for me. I no longer saw a man, but a poorly rehearsed actor, repeating fragile lines in an empty theater. And within me, a certainty grew like a quiet flame. Sooner or later, the stage will collapse. I knew the moment to look into his eyes was approaching. And when that moment arrived, there would be no more escape, because some truths cannot be contained, just like the glue that oozes and binds everything it touches. The weight of the silence began to become unbearable. Every time he entered the house, I felt the air change density, as if the walls absorbed the tension and returned it as cold. I could hear the creak of the door, the sound of keys hitting the table, and it was as if each gesture were an unspoken confession. The kitchen, which had once been my refuge, now felt like a stage for a dark theater. The sound of the kettle, the clink of the spoon against the cup, everything sounded like noise within a greater void. And there were moments when, even without tangible evidence, I could almost feel the weight of the other presence. The sweet perfume lingering on the collar of his shirt, the late-night messages, and the suspicious glow of his face-down cell phone. The contrast between the man who once promised me fidelity and the one who now hid behind excuses was stark, and I wondered how much longer he thought he could maintain this charade. The consequences weren't just in what he did away from me, but in what it provoked within the home. The long silences at the table, the distant gaze that avoided mine, the short words that cut like blades. I became a shadow in the space we'd built together, and that shadow began to transform into something denser, darker, like a harbinger of a storm. He didn't realize it, but each of his lies left a trail, and I followed those trails calmly, like someone patiently weaving a net meant to capture the hunter himself. There were nights when I would get out of bed and walk through the dark house. The cold floor beneath my feet, the distant sound of the silent street, the curtains moving gently in the wind. Everything seemed charged with signs, as if the house itself were whispering that something big was about to happen. I would touch the drawers, his clothes, searching for almost invisible clues, and each discovery, a forgotten receipt, a suspicious package, was like a spark igniting within me. The contrast was cruel. During the day, I maintained a smile, a semblance of normalcy, greeting neighbors, working, and going about my life as if nothing had broken. But at night, when the masks fell, the truth became unbearably clear. It was like walking down a hallway lit by flickering bulbs, sometimes light, sometimes darkness. And with each flash, I saw more clearly the extent of the betrayal unfolding before me. The fear of facing that reality haunted me, but alongside it grew something even stronger, the certainty that I would not allow myself to be reduced to that role. Not anymore. The pain, little by little, stopped being paralyzing and became fuel. I breathed deeply, felt my heart race, and with each beat, I knew I was approaching an inevitable decision. He believed everything would remain hidden, that his double life would never come to light. But I knew the truth has a way of seeping in, like water that finds its way through even the hardest rocks. I just had to wait for the right moment. And that moment was approaching faster than he could imagine. There were times when I wondered if that pain was mine alone, or if, somehow, the entire environment carried it with me. The dining table, for example, seemed to know more than it was saying. The wood held the echoes of old conversations, of laughter that had long since vanished, and now held only cold dishes and averted glances. It was as if the house, once alive, had lost its breath. And I walked through those rooms, feeling each wall as an accomplice to a suffocating secret. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and remember the beginning, when even the sound of keys turning in the lock brought me comfort. Today, that same sound made me hold my breath, waiting for the next lie disguised as an excuse. The contrast between then and now was too painful to ignore, like watching a photograph slowly fade until it became unrecognizable. But there were moments when I also found respite. Like one morning when, sitting on the porch, I felt the sun warm my skin. The world outside went on, indifferent to my silence. The birdsong, the wind rustling the leaves, life unfolding in small details. It was in this contrast that I realized something essential. Even within the pain, there was still beauty that could not be stolen. And it is at this point that many feel the urge to support this journey, leaving a silent sign that the message touched them. I began to realize that what hurt me most wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the way he believed himself untouchable, as if my perception were too small to unmask him. It was this look of superiority, almost contempt, that seeped into his every gesture. And I, on the other side, discovered that silence could be as powerful as a scream. Because while he underestimated my strength, I gathered every fragment of truth, transforming what seemed like weakness into strategy. The curious thing is that, if someone from the outside were observing, they might think we were just another couple in crisis. But anyone who's experienced something like this knows the signs. The chair that's too empty, the hug that never materializes, the laughter that dies before it can be born. These details, invisible to some, screamed at me like certainties. And I knew I couldn't ignore them forever. Some nights, lying in bed, I'd listen to the sound of the distant street, hurried footsteps, muffled voices. And I'd wonder if someone somewhere had ever felt exactly what I felt at that moment. A mixture of anger, sadness, and a silent flame of determination. This contrast kept me awake, because it showed me that I wasn't alone, that this pain, however unique it seemed, echoed in the hearts of others. And it was precisely in these echoes that I found the strength to carry on. Because as much as he believed his charade was intact, I knew the truth was approaching, inevitable, like a wave about to break against the rocks. I just had to wait. And the moment of rupture was coming, closer than he could ever imagine. As the days passed, I realized how the truth seeped into the most banal details. It wasn't just the perfume that didn't belong to me or the apologies repeated until they lost meaning. It was the absence of touch. The space between us in bed, once warm, now turned to a biting cold. I reached out and found only emptiness. This emptiness was more eloquent than any words, telling me unabashedly that there was no going back. Every dawn, I walked through the house as if crossing a minefield. The kettle whistled, the curtains moved in the breeze, the clock ticked away. Everything carried the tension of a secret about to explode. There was an almost physical sensation that the air had grown heavier, as if the walls held the whispers I couldn't yet hear. But alongside the fear, there was a spark of hope. A silent voice that reminded me that I wasn't a prisoner of that lie. This reminder surfaced in the most unexpected moments. In the smile of a neighbor who greeted me unaware, in the smell of fresh coffee that still warmed my mornings, in the subtle glow of the sun streaming through the window. It was as if the world reminded me, in small gestures, that there was still life beyond that pain. Even so, the contrast was stark. Between what I showed the world and what I carried inside lay a chasm. On the outside, I maintained a serene appearance, as if I were going about my daily routine without a hitch. But inside, it was like carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders, made up of distrust, anger, and a strange calm before the storm. There were nights when I lay awake, watching his outline in the dim light of the lamp. He slept peacefully, believing he was safe in his deception. And I, silently, felt my heart pounding, like a drum announcing the inevitable. The fear of confronting that truth mingled with the certainty that I could no longer retreat. It was like standing before a half-open door. I could already see what lay on the other side, but I hadn't yet stepped through. It was at this threshold that I began to perceive a new layer of betrayal. It wasn't just about him and his lover, but about the way he tried to erase my existence. With each lie, it was as if he were telling me that I didn't matter, that my voice was too small to be heard. This realization was painful, but it also gave me strength. Because the more he tried to reduce me, the more I discovered the greatness of standing tall. I knew the revelation was imminent. The atmosphere at home betrayed it. His gestures betrayed it. Even his silence betrayed it. It was as if all the elements around me were conspiring toward the same outcome. And I, patient, continued to collect invisible fragments, aware that soon nothing would be hidden. Suspense hung in the air, dense, inevitable, ready to snap like a rope stretched to its limit. With each passing day, the line between hope and fear grew thinner. It was like walking on a tightrope, feeling the wind rock my body as the abyss opened beneath my feet. There were times when I believed I could endure everything in silence, that I just had to wait for time to bring clarity. But all it took was one gesture from him, one misplaced detail, for the pain to throb again like an open wound. The dilemma wasn't just within our home. It was within me. I carried in my eyes the mark of someone who knows more than they let on, and this weight spilled over into other areas of my life. At work I smiled mechanically, but I felt my thoughts pulling me back to the same point. On the street, the sound of footsteps echoed like a reminder of the emptiness that awaited me upon my return. Even food seemed to lose its taste, as if my sense of taste had been stolen along with my confidence. And yet, there was a strange beauty in this process. I realized that the pain made me more attentive, more aware of the details. The smell of rain on the earth, the golden light streaming through the window in the late afternoon, the warmth of a cup of tea in my hands. These small fragments of life were like anchors, reminding me that I was not only made of the betrayal I suffered, but also of the quiet strength that flowed from it. The contrast was cruel and, at the same time, revealing. When he looked at me hurriedly, trying to hide something, I saw not only the man who betrayed me, but also the pathetic figure of someone drowning in fragile lies. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, even tired, even wounded, I saw the woman who resisted. Light and shadow coexisting within the same space, fighting for every inch of me. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed. If he noticed the way my silence transformed into something different, sharper, deeper. Maybe he thought my calm was weakness, that my distant gaze was indifference. But deep down it was just the harbinger. Because there are silences that don't demand an explanation. They announce. The nights grew long. I listened to the distant sound of passing cars, the ticking of the clock marking time in slow drops, and I felt as if each second brought me closer to a breaking point. Fear haunted me, whispering that I could lose everything. But hope stayed with me, steadfast, reminding me that perhaps it was precisely this everything that needed to be lost for me to truly find myself. It was a bated breath, as if the whole world were waiting with me. And I knew, deep down, that something bigger was about to reveal itself, something that would forever change the silence in which I lived. The silence that had previously felt like pain began to transform into calculation. His every gesture was watched, every word weighed, as if I were gathering pieces of a puzzle. I no longer walked through the house like a victim, but like someone studying the enemy on the battlefield. There was a new clarity within me, as if the shadow had given way to a blade of cold light. The fear still existed, but now it walked hand in hand with strategy. He believed routine was his ally, that repeating excuses would be enough to maintain the illusion. But he didn't realize that each repetition made him more predictable, easier to decipher. It was like watching a poorly rehearsed play. The lines sounded the same, the gestures became automatic, and the audience, in this case me, was already anticipating the next act. The difference was that, this time there was no stage, just real life, where every lie weighs heavily. I began to see the contrast between what he thought he controlled and what, in fact, was already slipping through his own hands. The hidden phone, the hastily packed clothes, the eyes that avoided mine. All of this, which he had thought small, became too big to remain invisible. It was like seeing a dam full of cracks. The water was already leaking, and it was only a matter of time before it burst. Within me, the feeling also grew that the story wasn't just mine. Because as I watched that plot unfold, I saw myself reflected in so many other people who have also faced this emptiness at home. And that's why, at times, I feel that sharing this experience awakens something in those who follow, as if each person carries their own hidden cracks. Many even comment because they recognize pieces of their own lives in my narrative. And perhaps you feel that impulse now, too. The consequences were beginning to manifest themselves in small explosions. The burnt dinner because he was late again. The unexpected visit from neighbors who noticed the tension in the air. The curious looks from family members who noticed the cracks in our practiced smile. All of this created a scenario in which his mask no longer supported the weight of the lie. I saw a curious force in this contrast. his effort to conceal, and the inevitable return of the truth imposing itself. It was a silent duel, between his haste and my patience, between the desperate attempt to preserve appearances and the serenity with which I awaited the revelation. Each accumulated detail was a reminder that the truth doesn't need to be forced. It reveals itself, inevitable, like dawn after the darkest night. But there was still something greater approaching, something that promised not only to expose but to transform once and for all the story I'd silently carried. Time began to take on a strange density. Each minute inside that house seemed to carry a greater weight, as if the walls held the secrets it tried to hide and returned them to me in silent whispers. The clock in the living room, with its steady ticking, no longer just marked the hours. It was like a constant reminder that the moment of truth was approaching. And this weight, though agonizing, also strengthened me. I began to notice my own posture shifting. Before, I'd lowered my eyes at his evasions. Now, I kept my gaze steady, observing every movement with calculated calm. This shift, however subtle, created a powerful contrast. He believed he still had control of the narrative, but he didn't realize that with each silence I made, I was the one gaining ground. Everyday scenes became charged with meaning. The simple act of folding a shirt revealed scents that weren't mine. The sound of the shower at night brought back memories of muffled phone conversations. Even the way he locked the guest room door, with unusual haste, betrayed more than any words. It was like walking through a gallery of paintings, where every detail, every color, every shadow told a part of the story he was trying to hide. But along with this clarity came uncertainty. What would I do with all this? How could I transform silent evidence into something impossible to deny? The fear of making a mistake stalked me like a lurking animal. And at the same time, there was the hope of finally freeing my voice, of showing that I wasn't the invisible woman he believed he had by his side. The contrast between these two forces kept me awake. I could feel my heart race when he arrived later than usual. I could feel my breath catch when my phone vibrated at unlikely times. It was as if every beat, every vibration, every dragging second was part of an invisible countdown. And yet, there were moments when I was surprised by the serenity that emerged amidst the chaos. A sunset scene from the window, the sky tinged with red, reminded me that everything has its time. That even the sun, before disappearing, leaves luminous marks on the horizon. This image stayed with me like a silent promise that the truth, sooner or later, would also illuminate what was hidden. It was in this interweaving of light and shadow that I walked. I knew the outcome was not far off, that the moment to break the silence was approaching like a storm announced by distant thunder. But there was still a step to be taken, a thread of suspense to be sustained, as if fate itself held its breath along with me, waiting for the inevitable moment when all would be revealed. With each new night, tension seemed to seep into even the simplest things. The dripping sound of the faucet became unbearable, as if each drop were a reminder of time slipping away. The clink of the glass against the sink sounded like a warning. Even the knock on the door when he arrived seemed to carry a greater weight than the silence that followed. It was as if the world around me had gained a new layer of sounds and images, all of them reminding me that the truth was about to spill out. I watched more than ever. The way he undressed hurriedly, trying to hide marks that weren't mine. The wrinkled clothes, carelessly stored, betraying blind encounters. And above all, his gaze. That quick, almost imperceptible shift, yet one that spoke louder than any words. It was in these details that I saw the fabric unraveling, like a worn fabric no longer able to support its own weight. At the same time, there was a counter-movement within me. A silent force that grew, like the roots of a tree spreading underground, invisible to the eye but ever stronger. This force allowed me to endure the doubt, the waiting, the proximity of the inevitable confrontation. And, curiously, it taught me that even in pain there is a way to learn. The contrast was constant. There were moments when hope emerged clearly, like a beam of light shining through a window in the morning. I took a deep breath and believed that soon everything would make sense. But then came the shadow, dense, cold, whispering that perhaps I didn't have the strength to bear the weight of the revelation. This alternation was what kept me awake, attentive, walking between two extremes. My body felt it too. My heart would race at random moments, my hands would sweat when he spoke softly on the phone, and even sleep became scarce. I would close my eyes and see images as if they were premonitions. The house full of voices, neighbors talking, curious faces watching the scene that had yet to unfold. These images weren't just figments of my imagination. They were signs of something inevitable, as if fate itself were rehearsing itself before me. And there was still the doubt. How far was I willing to endure this waiting? How far could I endure the taut rope without letting it snap? This uncertainty followed me like a silent shadow, always lurking, reminding me that there is no turning back when the truth finally prevails. So I continued, poised between the light that gave me strength and the darkness that threatened to swallow me. Each day was an invisible preparation, a rehearsal for the moment that still had no set date, but which I knew was getting closer. The suspense was in the air, thick, almost palpable, as if all time had been waiting with me for the moment when everything would finally become impossible to hide. That moment finally arrived, and when the truth asserted itself, it didn't come with screams or violent gestures. It came as a precise cut, like the snap of a rope that had been stretched too thin for too long. The red lights of the fire department reflected in the windows, and the sound of sirens echoed through the narrow street. The murmur of the neighbors spread like wildfire. He stood there, exposed, grotesquely trapped in his own lie. The scene he'd tried so hard to hide had become a public spectacle, and every glance around carried the same mixture of astonishment and contempt. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just stood there, watching, letting the weight of the revelation speak for itself. It was an image no one would forget. The man who had always considered himself above all else now depended on others to free him, not just physically, but from the shame he had created himself. And I, silently, felt the dignity they had so often tried to steal from me return with indescribable force. The transformation wasn't just about him being ridiculed, but about me recognizing myself again. For the first time in a long time, I felt my feet firmly planted on the ground, like roots that endure even after a storm. My breathing, previously shallow and heavy, was now deep, filled with a calm that only those who have endured chaos can understand. It was like watching the darkest night slowly open to the first ray of sunlight, bringing with it not only light but also the certainty that the worst was over. The contrast was powerful. On one side, his fall, visible, loud, impossible to deny. On the other, my silent, intimate, almost sacred rebirth. While he struggled with his own shame, I rose within myself, stronger, more whole, more aware of my worth. This difference marked the end of an era, not only in our marriage, but in the entire way I saw myself. And perhaps that's why many, upon following this story, feel that it also mirrors their own pain and overcoming. This is where a simple gesture can become profound, supporting this journey with a sign that it touched you, leaving a comment about what resonated most strongly in your life, and joining so many who chose to stay and listen to each new revelation. This is the power of transforming a personal narrative into something that belongs to us all. Looking back today, I understand that the greatest victory wasn't seeing him fall, but seeing myself stand up. I learned that a truly happy ending doesn't come from a promise made by another, but from the courage to say, enough, when respect is denied. What once seemed like ruin is now fertile ground for my new beginning. And it is with this sentiment that I end this confession, not as a victim, but as a woman who traversed the darkness and found her own light. If this story spoke to you in any way, please like, comment, and subscribe to continue experiencing these revealed truths with me. Because, in the end, the true privilege is discovering that we are never alone when we choose dignity.